Good test. Volume good. I do not have a handout. Okay, I'm going to turn it back to Red. Okay. I thought I'd start with a short prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for this Sabbath day and the chance for us in fellowship to learn more about this world you've given us and its great history, all in your glory. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, my name is Jason Zimmermann. For those of you that I haven't met yet, I want to thank Clayton Roberts for originally giving me the idea to do this, and for all the support of Brian Gaines and Jonathan and Kevin and all the help just to start. And I apologize for those I've missed. But Roman history is our topic today. It's a three-part series. This week, next Sunday, and hopefully the 5th of May. I don't know my May schedule yet, but sometime in May, ideally the 5th, will be the third and final lesson of what we're going to cover. And it's history class today, not Bible study. Next week, in the lesson number 3, we're going to focus on Christians among the Romans. But today, we seek to understand more about what Rome was. What is the context for the world that Christ came into, so that you can understand more about just what it was that the Christians had to overcome and eventually conquer. But even before I jump into the details, Roman history, it's always been a fascination of mine. There's a lot of interesting applications, but the idea of history itself, the very word itself, is fascinating if you look at it. It is his story. It is the story of God's unfolding of creation until we enjoy Christ's second coming. It's also useful knowledge. History itself, it teaches one long views, and by that I mean the eternal questions that mankind always asks in every age, how best to live. And I will say this, history actually enables me to maintain a more optimistic nature. I like to think anyone who argues that things have never been this bad before, for example, can't be too familiar with history. There's the trials man has encountered in the past and overcome helps bring peace to one's thoughts in the present. That's just one aspect of history that I find useful to consider. Today's presentation, like I said, is less Christian history. It's all Roman history. It sets the stage for the arrival of Christianity. Also, please feel free to ask questions. We're going to cover a lot of ground today. I've taught history at the Air Force Academy and at Norwich University in Vermont, and a lot of military history, but also ancient and medieval history. We're going to condense several lessons of Roman history into one, roughly covering about 500 BC to 50 BC in some, but I don't mind questions. In fact, I welcome them, so feel free to jump in if there's questions. The general idea of the next 3 lessons here and what we're looking at. Take a quick read of this quote, if you would. You're a wise man. You're a wise man. It sounds awful lot like something FDR might have said during World War II or Ronald Reagan in the 80s. But in fact, it was Titus Livius, a Roman historian. He wrote about the time of Christ. He wrote a 142-volume history of Rome. And he was talking about the Romans back in 197 BC when they went across the Adriatic Sea to free Greece from the Macedonian tyranny and then called all their troops home to Italy. And in other words, Rome was then in some ways like America today. It had interests far outside its own borders. Among the many differences, however, and there are many, was the fact that Rome was not just the world's lone superpower back then. It was almost the only power. Picture America Britain, Canada, Australia, Germany, all combined. Oh, and then throw in Russia and China too. And that gives you an idea of the power of Rome in the Mediterranean world 2,000 years ago. Rome was truly a colossus, and it's important to understand this when one considers what the early Christians were up against. Rome, by the time of Christ, absolutely dominated the known world from Syria to Scotland. But it wasn't mainly or only Roman military power that posed the threat to Christianity, but rather the cultural confidence of this Roman civilization. There's sometimes a misconception that the early Christian church merely filled a vacuum, that pagan worship was empty and dying out when Christianity emerged. And as we'll see, especially next week, when we start looking at the growth of Christianity in the early centuries, this was not true. Rome always had a very vigorous religious tradition. In fact, Romans always, from the beginning, saw themselves as the most religious of peoples, a subject we're going to look at it in next week's class and the one after that. I always like to recommend good books. If you enjoy the topic of a lecture, it's nice to know where to go to learn more. The Roots of American Order by a political philosopher named Russell Kirk, a fascinating look. Russell Kirk believed that all great and lasting civilizations have been put on earth by God for a divine purpose, even those that weren't Christian civilizations, like the early Romans. For example, the Hebrews, you can see the pictures of the four cities there. The Hebrews, the Greeks, the Romans, and the English. He describes in detail in this book. He saw the Hebrews and their most important contributions to Western civilization was their monotheism, their morality. The Ten Commandments alone were an incalculable benefit for Western civilization. John Adams, our own second president, once said, "If I were an atheist, I should still believe that fate had ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations." An interesting view. The Greeks, their democracy, their philosophy, their sciences, and their arts, all things that added to Western civilization, the Judeo-Christian civilization that we live in today. The Romans themselves, the engineering, their law, their stable government especially. Our founding fathers, more than any other ancient people, looked to the Romans for their example on how to build a stable government for the young United States of America. They didn't look to democratic Athens and their turbulent, short-lived democracy. They looked to the Roman Republic, which lasted almost 5 centuries, as we'll see here. It's no accident that one of our highest legislative bodies is called the Senate, for example. All our public buildings are based on Roman models. In any case, the purpose that Russell Kirk saw in Rome was for Rome and Roman power to be the hard shell that would protect the seed of Christianity while it took root in the West. Rome conquered the known world, and this would enable Christianity to spread all across the known world to all the nations. So Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome were the cradle of our Western civilization, but without Rome, Western civilization would not have survived the ancient world, which was a very, very dangerous place. Incidentally, to see what he believes to be the American cause, you should read his book there in the corner, The American Cause. It's a short read. Wrote it back in the 50s. Highly recommended that too. But in any case, let's talk about the Romans. What distinguishes the Romans from other ancient civilizations? The Romans themselves, especially the early Republican Romans, 500 BC to 50 BC roughly, they would say their virtue. In modern terms, the Roman character. What was Roman virtue? Well, it's based on the word vir. V-I-R in Latin is Roman for man. Virtue was what the Roman considered the best qualities of the best men. Energetic manliness is one translation of virtue to what it meant to a Roman. The early Romans, they were earnest, they were tenacious, well-disciplined and frugal, and often self-sacrificing when the state was in peril. The average Roman man, and I'm talking public officers, so we're talking about men here in this case, had a sense of duty, an attachment to honesty and honor that worked upon them. Every Roman knew that not only their gods, but their ancestors were watching them from the Elysian fields and as they conceived the afterlife, and their behavior was going to be judged when they themselves died and joined them. There was a sense of honor that's easy to forget or even to miss, and that the fact that there was in these early Romans very much to admire. It's obscured by the fact that every Hollywood production that depicts Rome tends to focus on the later imperial period, the more showy Rome of the Colosseum, for example, corrupt and decadent and powerful. I use a Dune analogy. Anyone seen the movie Dune? a couple of you. So I use the House Atreides, House Harkonnen analogy. It's imperfect, but it works for a quick mind picture. House Atreides, the noble early Republican Romans. House Harkonnen, the later decadent, corrupt, evil Roman imperial leadership. But at the time the Romans defeated Carthage, say the 3rd century BC, the Romans were virtually an incorruptible people. The crime of bribery and perjury was almost unknown in this early Roman Republic. And Polybius, a later Greek historian who wrote his history of the Roman people because of the astounding rise of this Roman Republic, he was trying to figure out why it was that Rome emerged so powerful. And he wrote that their integrity arose from their piety, and he was contrasting it unfavorably with his fellow Greeks at the time when he was writing about 100 AD. Among their other virtues, goodness, apart from patriotism. Patria is the fatherland, based on the Latin pater. Patriotism is the love of your fatherland. Patriotism and goodness did not exist apart from each other in the mind of a Roman. You couldn't be a good Roman if you weren't a patriotic Roman. All the men who counted were brought up to believe that their first obligation was to public service, and this is what enabled the Republic to endure for hundreds of years, always surrounded by very dangerous enemies. Rome would survive for so long precisely because of the cultural capital built up by Romans in these centuries. The time of Republican Rome, roughly, like I said, 500 BC to 50 BC. Virtues that only began to erode after the Punic Wars, about 200 years before the coming of Christ. So very long-lived civilization. Their founding legends, I should mention. Why do I mention these? Why do I mention founding legends? What do we have to learn from the story of Aeneas, which I'll briefly recount here? The stories a nation repeats about its great leaders show, as nothing else, the national ideal. To understand a people, you have to understand the ideal types that they honor, whom they praise. No other nation has tales of heroism and patriotic devotion and virtue to compare with the Romans. So the national ideal is an important factor in understanding a nation. In the Aeneid, it's the Roman national epic written about the time of Christ during the reign of Augustus by Virgil. Aeneas was a Trojan warrior who was witnessing the destruction of his city. The Greeks had just emerged from the Trojan horse and opened the city gates to allow the rest of the Greek army in. Troy was being sacked. The Romans, in their national legend, saw themselves as descendants of the ancient Trojans. Aeneas wanted to die fighting, but he was convinced by his family, his wife, and his father, his elderly father, seen on his shoulders there, Anchises, to escape the city and refound the city of Troy elsewhere in the Mediterranean. And so his wife was lost during their escape. They got separated, but his son Iulus and his father Anchises and Aeneas made it out of the burning city to journey across the Mediterranean, where, among other places, they stopped over on the north shore of Africa, the later Roman province of Africa, a city called Carthage, where Queen Dido fell in love with Aeneas. He fell in love with her. He wanted to stay there. She begged him to stay, but he knew that he had to obey the will of the gods and refound Troy, and so he left. And as legend has it, Queen Dido uttered a curse in her rage and sorrow as Aeneas left the shores of Carthage and prayed to the gods that there would be an avenger for her that would come upon his people someday. And later Romans saw that as being Hannibal, the Carthaginian leader during the Second Punic War, the Second World War of the Roman world. We'll talk about that briefly in a moment. In any case, the lesson there, what is the lesson? Aeneas obeyed the call of duty over the call of love, and that was a very Roman trait. Anyway, inside joke there. Romulus and Remus, the brothers. I'm not going to mention their whole story, but they were twin brothers. As legend had it, they were the sons of Mars, the god Mars, the Roman god of war. Tells you something about how the Romans saw themselves as being not only descended from gods, but the god of war, no less. Manlius Torquatus was a famous Roman in the Republican period. He was a father who had his own son executed for disobeying orders in battle. It's a legendary figure of deep significance, a hero of the early Republic. The lesson is, to repeat, a nation gets more of whatever type of person it chooses to praise the highest, and the Romans praised bravery. Now, ancient Italy about 400 years after the Trojan War, and as legend had it, the landing of Aeneas in Italy there on the west central coast. See that area of red where you have Latin-speaking peoples on the western coast of Italy, where Rome is centered today. The Latins, 400 years later, roughly 753 BC, the traditional date of the founding of Rome, they've spread to about 30 cities. There are about 30 city-states, small republics in this area of Italy called Latium. Today it's called Lazio, where the Latins live, in other words, the Latin speakers. Incidentally, today is April 21st. I forgot to mention this earlier. It's a nice coincidence. April 21st is Natale di Roma. It's the birthday of Rome. It's the date the Romans every year still celebrate the founding of their city, as legend has it, in 753 BC on this date. In any case, the Latins, if you were going to look at this map of Italy and see the different areas, the purple Umbrian-speaking areas where the Samnites lived east and south of Rome, the pink areas all along the southern coast and in Sicily there where the Greek colonies were planted, the orange areas to the north of Rome, the Etruscans lived there in Etruria, modern Tuscany. You wouldn't have bet if you had to figure out which people were going to one day dominate the Italian peninsula, let alone the entire Mediterranean, you probably wouldn't have put your money on the Romans in the middle of 30 Latin cities there. In 753, Rome was founded, and for hundreds of years, it was just one of many small city-states and kingdoms in Italy. There were hundreds of these free, independent city-states and kingdoms, and small, the Etruscan kingdom had 12 cities, for example, is all early in this history. But the Romans had the right disposition. We've talked about that Roman virtue, the right disposition for creating a powerful state. There's one historian that characterizes the Roman with the 4 F's, his memory device for remembering the most prominent features of the Romans: faith, family, farming, and fighting. It's a good way to summarize Roman character, Roman habits. Now, their faith wasn't Christian, not yet, obviously, but the pagan Roman faith included a very strong commitment to their patria, as I mentioned. This meant that every man was a soldier in the Roman army from age 17 to age 60. Each year, if the Senate voted for war, and almost every year they would, there would be a legio. A legio was a levy of citizens called up for service in the army, a draft. And the legio, the results of the legio, by that would be formed the legion, okay, the Roman army. And men would provide their own arms and armor. They would receive no pay. They would certainly hope to win spoils if they were successful in raiding or taking over a neighboring town. These early wars, the first couple centuries of Roman history, were what we would consider summertime raids of local countryside and neighbors. Nothing major like you picture in Hollywood movies talking about the imperial Roman armies later on. But at this point, the legion was made up of 60 centuries. A century is just what the Romans called a group of about 70 men. It was led by a centurion, the most effective and veteran, experienced soldier, a very tough customer, these Roman centurions that led these centuries. So a legion would total about 4,500 men. Nowadays, when we know how powerful Rome eventually became, we forget that Rome's survival was always in doubt for about the first 300 years of its history. In fact, in 500 BC, roughly the start of the Roman Republic, Rome was already almost 250 years old, but it was still only about 20 miles wide at its widest point. Still very, very small in Italy, very packed and populated with other states, other potential enemies. So this slide is just to kind of help you group in your mind the 3 major periods of Roman history. The regal period, Rome's start, 7 kings, as legend has it, there were 7 kings during this period ruling Rome. Long reigns of about 35 years each. In 509 BC, the Romans would chafe under the arrogance of Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the arrogant, Tarquin the proud, and the 7th king of Rome was thrown out, and they would start their republic. Now, instead of a king, which became a dirty word in Latin, rex, every Roman in the republic had to vow to never support a king in Rome. Rex was a very dirty word to the Republican Romans. They had 2 consuls instead. And the king's advisory body became the Senate. And the Senate would grow in importance and prestige for a very good reason over the next few centuries. This is the period, the Republic, of 509 to 31 BC, roughly 5 centuries that we're focusing on today, because this is what would create the Rome that Christ and his apostles would come to know centuries later. I should mention Roman relations with the other 30 Latin cities. And by the way, 12 plus centuries is only part of the story. At the very bottom, if you can read that, the Eastern Roman Empire survived far longer. Rome fell in 476 AD to the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, lasted for about 1,000 years more. So we're talking 22 centuries of Roman history. When Constantinople fell in 1453, they didn't call themselves Byzantines. They didn't call themselves Greeks. They called themselves Romaioi, Romans. Interesting fun fact there, at least interesting to me. In any case, Romans and the Latin cities is important to understand because much of Roman power is based on this relationship. Rome was the strongest of the 30 Latin cities in that area of Latium. Military operations were usually commanded by a Roman consul, and this was formalized by treaty eventually. But the point is, any enemy of a Latin city was considered to be the enemy of all, sort of like our NATO alliance. A Roman commander would always command the Latin army, half of which would be Romans and the other half of which would be drawn from the other 30 Latin cities. So that gives you an idea of the relationship between Rome and the Latin cities. It was larger, the most important of them, and half of their armies would be Roman, half would be Latin allies. All the foreign policies of the Latin cities were thus subordinated to Roman direction. Some major events, just to briefly touch on, I'm not going to go in detail on this whole slide, but in 396 BC, so about 110 years after the founding of the Republic, the new Roman state, where people would actually vote for their leaders, and it was a republic in the modern sense, they were at war with Veii. Veii was only 10 miles north of Rome. Tells you how big Rome was at this point. They were still fighting a major city, which was larger than their own, 10 miles north of them. It was an Etruscan city. The siege was very difficult, and they realized as they approached the end of the campaigning season, which was summertime, they had to get their soldiers home to bring in the harvest. They're going to have to tear down all their siege engines and works and rebuild them the next year. Well, the Senate decided, let's try something different. The Senate was always very innovative, willing to try new things, part of the Roman strength. And they said, how about we pay the soldiers and they can stay in the field and conduct this siege until it's all done, instead of having to bring them home and try again next year. And the siege would last 10 years and Veii would fall. This institution of military pay was important for a couple of reasons that might not seem obvious at first. Wars can now last longer because you don't have to bring soldiers home every fall to bring in the harvest. Wars can also be conducted much further from Rome because they can last longer, and you can go to Dalmatia or Hispania or North Africa and fight if the men receive military pay. The Gallic sack, 10 years after the fall of Veii, the Gauls from the north, and back then the north Gaul started at the Po River, which today would be considered north-central Italy, but back then Italy proper was just the peninsular part, not the part up by Milan and Venice today. They came and sacked the city of Rome. Won't go into details there, but the important point to note is that wouldn't happen again for 800 more years. 410 AD, Alaric and the Visigoths would sack Rome, which would seem like the end of the world to someone like St. Augustine witnessing this. And part of his writing the City of God was to help explain how this could have happened, because Rome seemed invincible and eternal for 8 centuries at least. The city was not sacked again. The Latin Confederation, I mentioned how it was formalized in a treaty, the Foedus Cassianum in 338 BC. This was a process that took about 400 years after the founding of Rome for Rome to gain formal dominance over Latium, that small area of red in the previous map. There were wars with the Samnites, the Pyrrhic War we're going to touch briefly on here in a moment, and the incorporation of the Greek colonies in the southern boot part of Italy along the coast there over the next 70 years. And so Rome's rise was truly meteoric. 400 years to gain control of the small area in central West Italy, and then just 70 more years, and they control the entire Italian peninsula. The Senate's prestige would grow during the course of this, because when you're constantly at war and you constantly have foreign enemies to worry about, the body that's in charge of your foreign policy, especially if that foreign policy is successful year after year after year, they're going to grow in prestige. The Senate, very important body of Roman ex-consuls. These senators were almost always ex-generals. The military route was always the route to power in the Roman political system. So let's look at that Roman conquest of Italy. How did it happen? What was the process of establishing Roman control? This control of Italy, starting with Latium, would provide the basis for future growth of Rome, because it provided Rome with a nearly inexhaustible supply of manpower. Rome would lose battles on occasion, but it never lost wars, largely due to this fact alone. And it highlights something distinctive about the Romans we should understand as well. When you see depictions of Roman centurions, for example, and barking orders, well, let me just say this. Romans at their best had quite a gift for command, okay? And it's an unsophisticated view that sees command as nothing more than yelling orders at people and expecting obedience. The Spartans, for example, never progressed much beyond that level of command, which is why their empire was so short-lived. The best commanders understand that to be truly effective, those you command need to want to obey your orders. The Romans were unequaled here. To understand their success, also you need to understand the context of the ancient world and ancient warfare. It was much more brutal than anything we probably picture today. When a city was conquered, the normal practice was for the victor to kill every surviving male, and I'm talking age 14 and older. Okay, all the children, the women, and the elderly that were left were enslaved, and then they would destroy the city itself, sometimes literally taking it apart stone by stone and leveling the place. Rome, however, and the Senate early on developed a new method, and this helps explain their growth, their successful growth, their long-lasting growth. Instead of destruction and that level, although they did sometimes do that, that was the norm in the ancient world, they also developed another practice, incorporating a defeated city. Instead of killing its remaining citizens and razing the site to the ground, the Roman Senate would wisely offer a form of mercy, a chance to join the Roman Confederation. The one thing the Senate would demand in return for this, among other things, but primarily always in every case, what they required of these incorporated cities was an annual levy of men for the Roman army. If the Senate voted on a war, had a legio the next year, this city, their leaders would be given a number, and that's how many men would have to come with their own equipment, their own armor, their own arms, ready for wherever the Roman consul, their general, would lead them in that year's battle. Otherwise policies, privilege sharing, this is, again, that Roman gift for command. The Senate came up with a different level of statuses for conquered territories. Some would be given Latin rights, for example. In other words, the rights of a city that previous Latin cities had enjoyed with Rome. The right to move where you wanted to, the right to intermarry with Roman citizens, for example, Latin rights. They would have civitas non suffragio, the right, Latin rights without the vote, for example, or they would have rights of full Roman citizenship. So the leaders, the elites, the political leaders in these conquered places would often be preserved in place and given Roman citizenship. And depending on the behavior of that new member of the Roman Confederation, they might get an upgrade in status eventually. And how did you get this upgrade? Well, by doing what the Senate wanted you to do, by providing the men, paying the requisite amount of taxes if they levied that on you. Maybe you'd get full Latin rights, maybe you get full citizenship rights, and maybe you'd be relieved of taxation in the future based on this upgrade in status. A very wise, very clever system for getting people to do what you want, especially the political elites who got more benefits and saw the benefit in following Rome's lead. So Roman colonization, not going to get into detail, but they also planted colonies to consolidate gains. So if they conquered part of Samnium and the Liris River was the new border, Rome would then plant a Roman colony at Fregellae. And suddenly 6,000 Roman citizens are living and farming there, and it becomes an outpost of Roman power. They would build a road to that location too, to make sure commerce and military operations could commence more easily. In any case, this helps explain Rome's successful imperialism in Italy, and it explains why, unlike any other ancient state, Roman policy was, again, another senatorial policy, they would never conclude peace after a Roman defeat. They could always replace their legions after military defeats. This nearly inexhaustible supply of men would be a surprise to King Pyrrhus, a little statue of King Pyrrhus up there. He was a Greek king. He was about 50 years after Alexander died. He styled himself as a new Alexander. Instead of heading east to the Persian Empire, he would head west and help the Greeks in Italy. As you can see by this map, yellow is the area of Latium, orange to the south is Campania, north is part of Etruria there. At this point, in about 280 BC, Rome controls with his confederation, the red area there, and the Greeks in the south. The Greek colonies were mostly in the south, Naples, Tarentum, Syracuse down in Sicily. They were worried about the growth of Roman power, and so they called in King Pyrrhus from Epirus across the Adriatic Sea, a Greek kingdom, to come help them. And he wanted to be a new Alexander, and so he said, sure. His army was something the Romans hadn't faced before. He fought in the Greek phalanx, the sort of, well, I'll talk about the phalanx in a moment, the kind of formation the Athenians and the Spartans were used to using. The Greeks, or the Romans themselves used a phalanx until about 300, 350 BC, they would switch. But more on the military side in a sec. He also brought elephants to Italy, something the Romans never faced in a battle before. Pyrrhus had 20 of them. Well, in 280 and 279 BC, 2 years in a row, Pyrrhus defeated the Romans in battle, both years in a row. He expected that their envoys would soon arrive to dictate the terms of his peace, or to learn the terms of his peace. Any other ancient state losing 2 major battles 2 years in a row would have to sue for peace. Only Rome had the ability to survive that. King Pyrrhus would wait in his tent for the peace envoys. He was going to dictate the amount of tribute they'd have to pay, the amount of land they'd have to give up, how many slaves he'd take. But waiting in his tent, all that came were more Roman armies. No other ancient state could do that. They marshaled the manpower to keep campaigning after 2 defeats, and Pyrrhus was at a loss. He didn't want to face the prospect of continuing this war versus Rome because his victories had been so costly. In one victory, he literally lost half of his army. It's where we get the term a Pyrrhic victory. It's a victory that isn't worth the cost it takes to win it. In any case, in 275 BC, in the Battle of Beneventum, the Romans won, and Pyrrhus sued for peace after this one defeat. Appius Claudius, a famous Roman senator, one of the first figures that truly emerges in Roman history and in written texts, had a famous response to Pyrrhus's envoys. He said, "Romans do not negotiate with an enemy whose forces remain on Italian soil." What's important here is notice that by 275 BC, Romans view all of Italy, at least the area from the Po River up north, south to the tip of the toe there, as their sphere of influence. Now Rome controls all of Italy by 270 BC, south of the Po River up there, down to the toe. Not Sicily yet, but down to the toe. That's in 270 BC, before they come in contact with another major Mediterranean enemy. I do have to talk a bit about the military side of matters because it explains a large part of Roman success and Roman power. The phalanx was a Greek formation, something I mentioned Pyrrhus using. It was a formation of very tightly packed lines of men, that drawing in the bottom left, for example, sometimes even 10 rows deep or more, men with very long spears, 12 to 18 feet, and they would mass up tight shoulder to shoulder and drop their spears in between the rows of soldiers in front of them, and you would literally march at the other force like a hedgehog of spear points, and it would meet in the center and try to push the other enemy off the field. Phalanx warfare is a Greek-style warfare. Very effective, very formidable. The Romans improved on this model with the manipular legion. It's where we get the name manipulate. The maniple, manus is the Latin for hand. In any case, much more versatile tactical formation. Maniples were each made up of 2 legions, so about 150 or so men in each maniple. These could operate independently on a battlefield, and if you had trouble here, but you're doing fine over here, you could detach maniples from this location and send them elsewhere on the battlefield during the course of a battle to attack and hit the enemy in the flank over here. You couldn't do that with a phalanx. You couldn't turn a phalanx 90 degrees to face a new threat direction. So it gave the Romans a great military advantage, just that alone. But enough on that. The Roman legionary and the Roman battle order. It's anyone seen Gladiator? The movie came out in 2000, Best Picture. Some of you, I see you 3 have seen it. In any case, there's a battle scene at the start of that movie, and it in Hollywood fashion, they sometimes change the way things really were. It highlights, it emphasizes the use of fire and artillery for visual effect, but the Roman battle order didn't require any of that for its effectiveness. A typical Roman battle would open with these pila. See the Roman pilum? It's a spear, a javelin, one heavy, one light. As this imposing mass of shields and helmets and spears approaches, the battle would typically open with a volley of 15 to 20,000 of these pila flying through the air. Now, they were lethally sharp, barbed points. About the last 12 inches of it was a softer iron that would catch in a shield, for example, if it impaled a shield and bend so you couldn't remove the pila from your shield. You'd be working to try to get this, if you survived the onslaught and didn't get hit by this spear, and your shield was impaled by it, you wouldn't be able to separate it from your shield, and pretty soon the Romans would be at you. So you'd have to throw your shield down. It was now useless to you. And about the time you're looking up from that, the second volley of pila comes in, even more deadly and effective than the first because now there's fewer shields to block them. And then, after the appalling psychological effect this must have had on you, seeing your buddy next to you transfixed to the ground by a spear, then the Roman mass of shields hit you. This was not a slashing affair with broadswords flying through the air. This was largely a stabbing affair. The Roman gladius, this gladius hispanus, the Spanish sword, flicking out between these shields. It was an industrial killing machine that was unequaled anywhere else in the ancient world. It was the best army, the best battle tactics the ancient world has ever produced, what the Romans fought with. In any case, discipline in this army was ferocious by modern standards. If a sentry fell asleep at his post at night, for example, the next morning he'd be beaten to death by clubs by the men in his legion, his own friends. If a unit disobeyed orders during a battle, or worse, retreated, the men of that legion would be decimated. Latin, deca, 10, every 10th man. They'd draw lots, and every 10th man would be executed by the others in his legion, and that legion would be far more obedient in the next battle, I'll tell you that. Such practices tended to instill extreme obedience in these Roman soldiers. With such iron discipline, the Romans almost always won their battles. An outnumbered force can only win if they have more discipline than those who outnumber them. At the Battle of Sentinum in 295 BC against the Samnites, there were 36,000 Romans and 100,000 Samnites, and the Romans emerged victorious. That only happens with extreme discipline. The fear of running away is far greater than the fear of losing the battle, in other words. That's the Roman army. That's the Roman effectiveness against their enemies. So by 264 BC, you can see on this map, there's Italy, the Roman area, the Roman Confederation in red. Rome had control over most of the Italian peninsula. It was now that Rome would come into conflict with the Carthaginians, who dominated the western Mediterranean Sea. Carthage is in modern-day Tunisia. In fact, the site of Carthage is very near Tunis. On the coast there is an excellent harbor, excellent location. It was settled around 800 BC by the Phoenicians, a people closely related to the Philistines of the Bible from the area of Lebanon, a Semitic people. They were called Punii by the Romans, P-U-N-I-I in the Latin plural, and that's why we talk about the Punic Wars of Rome versus Carthage, not the Carthaginian Wars. The Romans called the Carthaginians Punii, hence the Punic Wars fought between Rome and Carthage. In any case, where did this begin? It began overseas, and by overseas I mean it in Roman standards of the 3rd century BC. You can see the satellite shot on the top there, the very tip of Italy in the bottom right, and then Sicily, the triangle-shaped island there just off the coast through the Strait of Messina, called Messina back then, Messina today. You can see a modern picture with that radio tower looking across. It's not that far, but it is not on the continent of Europe. It's not on the peninsula of Italy. It's just off the coast. Anyone know who that gentleman in the bottom right is? Yeah, Patton. George S. Patton Jr. in 1943 would land in Sicily as well. I couldn't resist throwing that in there. The Punic Wars. Roman wars tended to come in threes. I don't know why, but here we are. These were titanic struggles. This was not low-intensity conflict. Serious World War II level campaigning year after year after year. The First Punic War lasted 23 years, for example. And naval battles were often even bigger than the land battles. It's hard to imagine these numbers today. And it's far larger than modern battles today in numbers of men involved, and far, far, far larger than medieval battles where 5,000 men was a huge force. Sometimes there would be 200,000 men engaged in naval warfare alone. These quinquiremes, these massive warships with 3 banks of oars. I love this painting here because it shows how formidable this must have looked from the water level. You can see a soldier standing with a spear up higher on the deck there above that 3rd bank of oars. These things were equipped with beaks, rams. If you've ever seen Ben-Hur, either the Charlton Heston version or the more recent version, there's a good depiction of what naval warfare looked like with these ships. They would try to ram other ships 90 degrees on, ideally, and sink them, and then look for more victims. 400 men on each of these ships, and battles sometimes had 300 ships per side. They were giant affairs. And they're also a great example here in 255 BC of Roman tenacity. The Romans had a land warfare tradition. They were not naval warriors. They had to learn a lot very quickly, fighting the Carthaginians in Sicily, mainly for the control of Sicily. That was the site of the First Punic War. And in 255 BC, there was a naval disaster. The inexperienced nautical soldiers in Rome, they suffered from a huge mistake. They left their fleet unsheltered, and there was a 3-day storm, destroyed 70% of their fleet. 220 out of their 300 ships just gone. And just to give you some perspective, losing 70% of your fleet, more like 73%, at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy sunk 3% of the American fleet, 26% of our battle fleet, but it was a devastating loss to America, and that was just 26% of our battle fleet. The Romans lost 70% due to weather alone. In typical Roman fashion, however, Rome rallied, and 3 months later had built an entire 200 and more ships to replace those that had been lost. Notably, the leading citizens of Rome, the more wealthy families, contributed, and they had a sort of a fund drive, sort of like a war bond drive, and each aristocratic family, wealthy family, would build and equip an entire ship on their own dime. So that sort of patriotism, that sort of love of country, essential for the survival of Rome. These disasters would have been enough for most states to call for an end of the war. It's a trend in Roman history, though. Catastrophes that would make others sue for peace only made the Romans work harder. And in the Second Punic War, Rome lost over 100,000 killed in its first 3 battles alone. All right? So 218, 217, 216 BC, the biggest disaster of all, the Battle of Cannae. Let's put that in perspective. That would be like losing all of our American soldiers we lost in Korea and Vietnam combined in just the first 3 battles. And yet Rome could fight on. In the 3rd battle alone, the Battle of Cannae I mentioned, 1 out of 7 of all Italians capable of bearing arms was killed in one afternoon. It was Rome's darkest hour. 80 senators out of the 300 in the Senate were killed in that battle. That'd be like us losing 143 senators and congressmen in a firefight today. It sounds incredible, but that was Rome back then. And yet there was no thought of negotiation. When Hannibal offered to ransom the Roman POWs, the Senate declined. The Senate policy was that nothing should look as if the Senate thought of peace. The people must know that safety lay only in victory. With this awesome will, Rome prevailed, and by the end of the 2nd century BC, about 130 BC, Rome not only controlled all of Sicily and much of North Africa by alliances, but all of the eastern Mediterranean as well. I got to mention the Corvus. Again, Roman strength wasn't just their gift for command and the wise policies of the Senate and their system of colonies and incorporation and confederation, but also Roman ingenuity. Rome had the cultural confidence to draw the best ideas they saw from other cultures around them and adopt them for their own use. And this here, the Roman Corvus, the raven, was an entirely Roman invention, but it shows that spirit of innovation, willing to try new things that might work. And as I mentioned before, the Romans were very good at land battle, not very good at naval battle, at least initially. And so what they devised was a gangplank with spikes on the end of it, a 4-foot by 36-foot stretch of wood that would be mounted on top of each of their ship's decks. And when the Carthaginians saw the Roman fleet approaching, their ships looked awful funny with these things sticking up. But instead of trying to ram the enemy ship, the Romans would try to come alongside them. And then they would swivel this thing, drop it, and it would impale the deck of the Carthaginian ship. And now your naval battle just became a land battle. And the Roman Marines would rush from their ship to kill everyone on the Carthaginian ship. Every Carthaginian ship that the Romans attached to was taken. and destroyed. The Romans won the wars against the Carthaginians. I'll also mention one last thing about the Carthaginians, an interesting side note. I mentioned they were descended from Phoenician ancestors, the Phoenicians that were one of the most depraved peoples in the ancient world. Living alongside the Philistines, they were the same people who sought to corrupt the Israelites with their pagan practices, who sacrificed their own children to Baal, for example. And in Matthew 11, 20 to 24, Jesus mentions the Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon as being wicked, just like Sodom. In fact, the name Hannibal itself means the glory of Baal. This is why G.K. Chesterton, a 19th century thinker, would write about the Punic Wars as a story of the good pagans, Rome, versus the bad pagans, Carthage. Chesterton saw in Rome the highest achievement of man apart from grace. And although Romans are criticized for later leveling Carthage in 146 BC, they didn't incorporate that city, Chesterton saw a parallel here with God's command to the Israelites to utterly destroy the Philistines in their land. I found that interesting, but we're going to jump forward a century here in the interest of time. We reach by the 50s BC, the end of the Roman Republic. The end of the Republic is often described in history as the Roman Revolution. It wasn't an overnight revolution. It was about a century-long process of the dissolution of the republican forms of the Roman Republic, 133 BC to 31 BC, with the emergence of Augustus as sole emperor. The career of Julius Caesar played a major part in this drama, and while his role in destroying what remained of the Roman Republic is perhaps less admirable in a worldly political sense, his conquest of Gaul in the 50s BC took about 8-9 years, probably prolonged the life of Rome and its later empire by about 200 years. Gaul became one of the most important and prosperous and populous provinces in the Roman Empire. Gave great strength to the Romans trying to fight the Germans coming across the Rhine, for example. And these 200 years that some historians estimate Caesar's conquest extended the Roman Empire by would be critical years for the growth of Christianity, as we're going to see next week. And so, by the time of Christ, the known world was dominated by Roman power. And with a few more additions to the territory, Britain, for example, in the 1st century AD, and Romania, over there in the northeastern part there, in the 2nd century AD, they would hold Mesopotamia off and on, briefly around 105 AD. Christianity would emerge in this world, and after long centuries, conquer and even outlast this vast empire. Do you have any questions? I'll start by answering the first one you probably have. It's 166 days till the start of the college hockey season. October 4th will be here before you know it. So that's usually the first question I get, so I just thought I'd preempt you guys. Well, as I said, next week we're going to cover Christianity itself, the emergence of this new religion. We're going to look closely at a couple books. There's a book called the Christians as the Romans Saw Them, and another book entitled Pagans and Christians. And we'll learn a lot more about what was going on the religious side of things, the cultural side of things. We're actually going to look a bit at Roman culture itself too, the games and things that the Romans did for fun, but mostly about their religion and the Greek and Latin critics of this new Christian religion that they saw emerging in the East. Thank you very much.